Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to The Drowsy Historian, the corner of the internet where the past is anything but sleepy, even when we're talking about the art of sleep itself. Tonight, I'm inviting you to close the door on your modern bedroom and step into a world where bedtime was not a personal luxury, but a communal ritual, where the warmth of animals and the rhythm of the seasons shaped every breath you took. Forget memory foam and LED alarm clocks, because the Vikings, those seafaring legends of the North, may have cracked the code for the deepest, most restorative sleep humans have ever known. And no, this isn't some romantic exaggeration. It's a combination of clever engineering, brutal climate, and a lifestyle so physically demanding that by the time night fell, your body was ready to surrender to dreams with the certainty of a falling axe. Picture yourself standing outside a Viking longhouse on a winter evening in what is now coastal Norway. The sky is a heavy slate grey, streaked with the last embers of a sun that barely lifted itself above the horizon all day. Snow drifts like fine flour across the frozen ground, and the wind carries the sharp tang of pine and salt from the nearby fjord. Your nose stings with the cold, and every exhale turns into a plume of silver mist. Then a heavy wooden door opens, and you step inside. Instantly, the world changes. The icy roar outside dies into a muffled hum as warmth rushes toward you like a living animal. Smoke from the central hearth coils upward into the dim rafters, and a dozen small sounds. The shuffle of boots on timber, the crackle of resinous pine logs, the low murmur of human voices, wrap around you like a thick woolen cloak. The first thing you notice is the layout. This isn't a house with private bedrooms or neat little beds aligned against the wall. It's one vast room, long and narrow, built from interlocked logs and sealed with moss to keep out the cutting wind. A fire burns in the centre, its glow painting the carved wooden beams with gold and copper light. Sleeping platforms line the walls, raised just enough to stay dry, and covered with straw, animal hides, and blankets so heavy they could double as sails. The air smells of smoke, wool, and the faint sweetness of stored grain. It is earthy and alive, a stark contrast to the sterile climate-controlled air of a modern apartment. As you take it in, you realize that nothing about this arrangement is random. Where you sleep says everything about your role in the household. Elders and honoured guests occupy the coveted spots closest to the fire, where the warmth pulls deepest and the floor stays dry. Parents and working adults spread out slightly farther, sharing heavy furs and body heat. Children curl around the edges like petals around a flower, their smaller bodies protected by the ring of older sleepers. This hierarchy is practical. Elders need the most warmth to survive the harsh night, but it's also symbolic. Sleeping near the hearth isn't just a matter of comfort, it's a sign of respect, a nightly reminder of whose wisdom keeps the household alive. The bedding itself is a marvel of adaptation. Forget feathery duvets or light synthetic throws. Viking blankets were dense slabs of woven wool, spun from the fleece of hardy northern sheep that grazed the rocky hillsides. Women spent hours each day cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving this wool into fabric thick enough to trap heat through the longest winters. Some families added layers of animal skins or stuffed straw mattresses beneath the blankets for extra insulation. These weren't decorations, they were survival tools, built to last through years of smoke, frost, and constant use. Modern textile engineers might talk about thermal retention or moisture wicking, but the Vikings didn't need jargon. They simply felt what worked and kept perfecting it. Nightfall here doesn't mean a quick collapse into exhaustion. It's a slow ritual, a communal unwinding that begins long before the fire dies. After a day of hauling nets, chopping wood, or weaving sails, bodies move with the heavy grace of people who have earned their rest. Conversations soften into low laughter. Stories of gods and monsters flow like warm mead, and children drift off mid-tale as shadows dance across the beams. The sounds of animals, the quiet bleat of a goat, the sigh of a cow shifting in its pen, the soft purr of a cat, are not disturbances but lullabies. In a world where predators and storms lurk beyond the walls, noise signals safety. Silence would mean something is wrong. As the hearth dims to a red glow, You feel the cold nibble at your cheeks, but beneath the layers of wool, your body is perfectly warm. Your muscles, tired from real physical work, loosen with each breath. There is no flicker of blue light, no buzzing electronics, no endless mental list of tasks waiting for morning. Sleep is not something to optimize or hack. It is a state that arrives naturally, carried on the rhythm of firelight and human voices. You are not simply resting. You are entering a space where life and dream blur, where the gods of old were believed to send messages through the fabric of night. This is the first secret of Viking sleep, and it's not a gadget or a supplement. It's a way of living that aligns body and environment so perfectly that rest becomes inevitable. By the time you lay your head on a straw-filled pillow and pull the heavy wool across your shoulders, the outside world has ceased to exist. The wind can roar, the sea can rage. But inside this longhouse you are wrapped in a warmth older than memory, a rhythm of life that no modern bedroom can replicate. And as the last story fades and the fire sighs into embers, you finally understand why ancient sagas claimed the gods themselves watched over these nights. Here, in this timeless cocoon of smoke and fur, sleep is not just rest, it is communion, a nightly return to the heart of the human experience. The fire sinks lower until only a dull glow remains, a breathing red heart that pulses beneath the timber beams. Shadows climb across the walls, turning carvings of beasts and trees into living figures that sway and dissolve. The air thickens with warmth, smoke, and the smell of wool, while outside the wind claws at the roof, powerless to break the cocoon of the longhouse. You shift under the weight of layered furs and woven wool, and there is a moment when the cold tip of your nose reminds you of the world beyond, but your body remains wrapped in deep comfort. The breathing of those around you forms its own rhythm, a chorus of slow inhales and soft snores that lull the mind into a state halfway between waking and dream. This is where the Vikings mastered something we rarely allow ourselves, the art of aligning with the season instead of resisting it. In the dark months of winter, when daylight was a fleeting visitor and snow weighed heavy on the land, sleep became longer, deeper, and deliberately extended. To modern ears that might sound like laziness, but to them it was survival strategy. Energy spent needlessly was energy lost, and so households slowed down, eating less, moving less, conserving strength. Sleep was not stolen in short bursts, but taken in long stretches, with people dozing for hours, waking for small tasks or hushed conversations, then drifting back under the heavy layers. The night itself became elastic, stretching to contain cycles of rest and wake that were accepted rather than fought. Imagine lying there, the fire sinking, livestock shifting in their pens, a dog curling closer at your feet. Someone adds a log to the coals, and the flare of light briefly illuminates the faces of those around you. Children stirred from half-dreams tuck themselves tighter against a parent. An elder mutters a fragment of a saga before sleep silences him again. Every element in the room serves the purpose of rest. The architecture holds back the storm. The blankets trap body heat. The animals radiate warmth, and the household itself, bound together, becomes one living organism dedicated to survival through slumber. Dreams carried weight in this world. They were not dismissed as random sparks of the mind, but interpreted as messages, warnings, or glimpses of the divine. A farmer might wake and recall a vision of wolves running across the snow, and the household would debate its meaning at dawn. A child's nightmare could be seen as a sign of spiritual sensitivity, a thinness of the veil between mortal and unseen realms. Kings in sagas received prophecies in sleep, and warriors dreamed of their deaths before battle. The boundary between night visions and waking truth was porous, and the longhouse was not only a shelter for bodies, but a theatre for the imagination, where gods and spirits could whisper in the crackle of embers and the shifting of shadows. The cold itself became part of the recipe. While furs and wool kept bodies insulated, the air remained sharp, nipping at exposed skin, ensuring that sleepers were never overheated. Modern science has proven what the Norse already felt in their bones. Cooler air supports deeper, more restorative rest, reducing inflammation and allowing the immune system to strengthen. Inhaling cold air while the body stays warm beneath blankets produces a clarity upon waking, a sense of renewal rather than grogginess. What we replicate today with air conditioners and open windows, they achieved by necessity. Their houses built with drafts and seams that kept the interior brisk enough to sharpen the lungs without freezing the blood. Every detail of the night reinforced connection rather than isolation. You could hear the chickens murmur in their roosts, the occasional stomp of a horse, the slow shifting of a cow. These sounds were signals of safety, proof that the household, human and animal alike, was intact and alive. Silence, by contrast, was frightening. A predator might be near, a roof beam might have cracked, or worse, someone might have failed to wake. In this sense, the longhouse at night was less like a dormitory, and more like a symphony of living beings, each playing a part in the rhythm of survival. The low hum of voices, the rustle of straw, the hiss of the hearth, these were lullabies older than any cradle song. Even intimacy wove itself into this environment. Couples shared furs, hands brushed in the dark, words were whispered so quietly they blended with the breathing of the room. In a culture where marriage was often tied to alliances and property, these nightly moments of warmth carried an intimacy beyond contracts. They offered comfort, continuity, and a reminder that even in a harsh world, tenderness could be found under the same blanket that kept frost from stealing your breath. Children grew up watching these silent exchanges, learning that survival was not only about strength, but about connection, the small gestures that stitched families together. When dawn arrived, it did not announce itself with alarms or glowing screens. Light crept slowly through the cracks, a grey wash over the beams, a gradual shift rather than a jarring signal. People stirred not in panic, but in context, rising when it felt natural, guided by instinct and the subtle cues of environment. Some might wake to stoke the fire, others to tend animals, but there was no rush to beat a clock, no dread of an artificial schedule. The day unfolded as an extension of the night, and because waking was never violent, the transition carried a quiet dignity. The body accepted the rhythm rather than fighting it, and this acceptance gave each day a solidity modern life often lacks. As you picture yourself in that space, wrapped in heavy wool, surrounded by breath and warmth, it becomes clear why historians describe Viking sleep as some of the most complete in history. They did not optimize or track it, nor did they treat it as wasted time. Sleep was woven into the very structure of existence, a tool as vital as the axe or the plough. In surrendering fully to the night, they discovered a depth of rest that modern bedrooms, with all their gadgets and interruptions, rarely allow. The gods might not have handed them a secret formula, but the world they built gave them what many of us crave, the feeling of safety, belonging, and total rest beneath the endless northern sky. Chapter 2. The last light of the day dies slowly behind the thick log walls of the longhouse. A final bucket of ash is shaken over the fire pit, and the embers are left to breathe beneath their veil of soot. One by one, bodies return to their places. Not in rooms or beds with crisp sheets, but in a silent choreography of warmth and status woven through centuries of tradition. Where you lay your head in a Viking longhouse wasn't just a matter of comfort. It told a story about your age, your role, your strength, and sometimes even your survival. The hearth, still warm from the day's fire, sits like the sun at the centre of this human constellation. Its glow defines the logic of placement. Nearest to the flames sleep those who are oldest, most honoured, or most fragile. The fire does not play favourites. It radiates heat indiscriminately, but the people who surround it do not lie down at random. Every sleeping arrangement is a quiet signal, a reflection of kinship, memory, and need. The central space belongs to the elders, the ones who carry the stories and the skills no one dares forget. Age earns you proximity to heat, but not just out of reverence. The cold is cruelest to old bones. Without the hearth, they ache. With it, they last another winter. Sleeping here is not only a mark of status, it is life extended by inches, night by night. Around these elders curl their children, and their children's children, a ring of protection and affection that mirrors the way warmth moves outward in soft gradients. Parents and warriors lie just beyond the ring, strong enough to bear the cooler air, but still close enough to spring up in defence should the door creak or the wind rise too suddenly. At the outer edges lie the younger ones, sons not yet proven, daughters learning the quiet rituals of adult life, visiting kin, and often the servants or thralls. They are expected to endure more. Their youth buys them distance from the fire. But even here, among the timber walls that sweat frost on the coldest nights, the longhouse still holds them. Blankets of fur, shared body heat, and an understanding that this rotation, like all things in Viking life, is not fixed. A back injury, a lingering illness, a well-timed favour, any of these can pull someone closer to the hearth or push them out toward the cold. The placement is not a rigid caste system, but a living map of family, survival, and respect. A sick child might be moved inward for a night. A new mother might sleep where her child stays warm. A returning sailor, his skin still marked by salt and wind, might earn a space nearer the fire just for a while. These micro-adjustments pass without ceremony, noticed but rarely questioned. In this house, hierarchy breathes. It bends, contracts, and expands as needed, all within the bounds of unspoken rules laid down long before anyone still alive was born. Every body, every blanket, every pause of breath in the night creates an architecture of care and calculation. But this care is not coddling. It is survival mathematics. The strong endure the cold because they can. The old sleep closest because they must. The young are pushed to the periphery so they can harden, learn to shiver, and still wake whole. Even love has to make room for logic here. Affection does not override warmth. To offer someone your spot near the fire is an act of real sacrifice. In some cases, it's remembered. In others, it's simply what must be done. There's also the matter of watchfulness. Not everyone sleeps through the night. Someone always listens. The man who stirs at the faintest creak, the woman who hears the goat's breathing change. Near the door, one or two adults sleep lightly, wrapped tightly, armed with nothing more than a spear or a sharp bone blade. Their role is silent but vital, to rise first, to meet danger, to be the thin shield between dreamers and the dark beyond the walls. They sleep cold, but they sleep ready, and the rest sleep deeper because they know someone else remains alert. Even within these boundaries, personal items mark sleeping spaces. A carved comb here, a wooden bowl there, perhaps a lock of hair or a rune-etched stone. These aren't decorations, they're signals. This is my place. This is where I return. And while no one owns their sleeping spot in the modern sense, these quiet objects lay claim with an authority stronger than spoken words. Everyone knows not to disturb them. Everyone knows what it means to find your blanket replaced or your things moved. Some shift has occurred, some quiet decision made. You lie now somewhere within this circle, perhaps on the edge, where your toes numb before dawn, or perhaps close to the fire, where heat rises through the floorboards and the scent of pine sap clings to your skin. Wherever you are, your place was given, not taken. It's the result of 100 calculations, who you are, what you've done, what you're capable of enduring. And as sleep overtakes the room once more, these positions turn into something deeper than convenience. They become a nightly affirmation of trust, the old trust, the young to watch, the strong trust, the fire to keep burning. The entire household trusts the shape of itself to hold through the night, even as the world outside howls and freezes. Tomorrow, the shape may shift. The fire will die and be lit again. Blankets may be shared differently. A new story may need to be told before sleep returns. But for now, the hierarchy holds. And in the soft, smoky dark, every breath confirms that even in a brutal world, there is structure, there is care, and there is room enough for rest. When the longhouse falls fully silent again, the weight of the arrangement becomes even more apparent. Bodies have taken their places, breath flows in steady waves, and the hearth glows like a heart buried beneath blankets and slumber. No one speaks now. Even the animals have stilled, their movements softened by the certainty that warmth and company surround them. But beneath this calm lies an unspoken awareness. Every sleeper knows their position and what it means. It's not a matter of pride or vanity. It's about memory, responsibility, and the thin line between comfort and cold. The oldest among them are not simply placed near the fire because they are weak. They are repositories of memory. Their minds hold the names of the dead, the exact places where fish gather in spring, the words to the stories that make up the household's soul. Their placement is as much spiritual as it is practical. To sleep near them is to sleep near the history of the people, to drift off with the scent of burning pine in your nose and the steady sound of a voice that might whisper a myth even in its sleep. Sometimes that myth is more than memory. The fire may flicker, and in its patterns you might see things, shapes like wings or antlers, or the face of a god curling in the smoke. Children stare into those flames until their eyes flutter shut. Their dreams bloom out of light and shadow, carrying them to places far from timber walls and snow-covered fields. When they wake, they recount what they saw, and if their dream is strange enough, someone listens closely, because now and then the gods speak through the smallest voice. Farther from the hearth, the dreams grow colder. Not worse, just different. You sleep lightly here, ears always half-tuned to the wind. You wrap yourself tighter, one foot against the dog curled at your feet, one hand near the hilt of your knife, not out of fear but routine. You know your place, and you accept it. Not everyone can sleep by the fire, but everyone can sleep securely if the order is respected. If someone shifted positions without cause, it would be noticed. Not scolded necessarily, but noted. These subtle breaches of order ripple through the house like smoke through rafters. A child moved too far from warmth might wake with a cough. A warrior too close to the fire might be accused, silently, of growing soft. But warmth is not always about fire. There are other kinds. Shared breath, layered furs, the press of a familiar body. Married couples lie wrapped together, not for romance, but for efficiency. Though affection exists here, it often expresses itself in the language of survival. A hand pulling a blanket tighter. A whispered warning about frostbite. A body shifting to block a draft. This is love shaped by climate and duty, not declarations and gifts. And yet, it may be more honest. Every night, each person commits to the warmth of others, not metaphorically, but with their actual, breathing bodies. The young learn by watching. They see how closeness is offered, how distance is respected, and how space can be earned. They learn that the hearth is not a prize but a responsibility. If you sleep closest, you wake earliest. You feed the fire. You tend to the embers so that others don't wake up cold. That duty binds you to the household in a way few roles can. Your warmth is borrowed, and so you repay it. One missed morning, one fire left too long, and the entire chain could falter. There is no room for neglect, and so each position in the sleeping world comes with its own unwritten contract. In some households, that contract spans generations. A child who once slept near the walls might one day move inward, earning space not through demand, but by presence, being the one who wakes without complaint, who checks the goats before dawn, who lifts the sleeping child and tucks them into their own furs without ever expecting thanks. Gradually, without words, the household shifts around them, pulling them closer to the heat. And when the time comes, they will become the ones who hold stories, who rest near the fire, not because they are weak, but because they have carried the cold long enough. This slow rotation of roles is never announced. No ceremony marks the change, but every member of the house feels it. One night, you look up from your corner and notice that your father's place has been taken by your uncle, that the old woman who told you tales now sleeps closer to the door, preparing perhaps for a different kind of journey. The patterns shift like seasons, and you grow older in your sleep, moving through warmth and distance as naturally as the sun arcs through the sky. Even visitors understand the rules. A travelling craftsman or seer might be given a spot near the hearth for a night or two, a gesture of respect and hospitality, but they know not to make themselves too comfortable. Proximity to the fire is lent, not given. It carries a weight. Misuse it, and the longhouse will remember. Not with anger, just with a subtle coldness, the kind that finds its way under your blanket and lingers in your bones. As the fire breathes and the sleepers settle, the house itself becomes a kind of map, not one drawn on parchment, but one marked in heat and breath and shared silence. You could walk through the dark, eyes closed, and know where you were by how the air feels on your skin. Warmer here, an elder, colder there, a restless child. Somewhere in between, someone dreaming of distant forests, their fingers curled in the fur of the dog at their feet. The sacredness of this arrangement is not mystical, it is earned. Each night is a renewal of the compact between body and shelter, between heat and hierarchy. When you wake, you do so with a clear understanding of who kept the fire alive and who benefited from it. Gratitude flows not in words, but in returned favours, in shared labour, in the quiet acknowledgement that no one survives alone. And when the next storm comes, when the thatch rattles and the cold presses against the seams, you know without looking that the warmth will hold, because this is not just where people sleep. It is where they remember, protect, endure. In the glow of the hearth, surrounded by the slow rhythm of human breath, you understand the true meaning of belonging, not just to a family or a house, but to a living, breathing world of warmth kept sacred through order, memory, and the gentle weight of one body beside another. Chapter 3. Wool, Furs, and Straw. The ingenious Viking bedding system. The fire has dulled to a soft red shimmer, and outside the longhouse the wind gathers strength. Ice cracks in distant trees. The sky turns the colour of ash and bone, and snow begins to drift sideways against the walls. But inside, beneath heavy blankets and coarsely woven wool, the stillness feels absolute. If the world outside wants to howl, let it. In here, the Vikings have prepared well for its fury. It begins with the base layer, a platform of hewn wood or packed earth, sometimes slightly raised, sometimes hollowed slightly to allow for better insulation. On this they place bundles of straw, dried moss, or even seaweed, all compressed by years of use into something like a primitive mattress. It's not soft in the modern sense, but it cushions just enough. Above that rests the warmth, animal skins, heavy cloaks and blankets so dense they hold heat like walls. Nothing about this sleeping system is accidental. Every item, every texture, every layer has a purpose shaped by experience and necessity. Not the feather-light wool of delicate scarves, but a dense, oily, lanolin-rich variety shorn from the thick-coated sheep bred to survive bitter Nordic winters. These animals are not gentle creatures. They are shaggy, hardy, and their fleece grows in stubborn waves that repel wind and moisture. The meat was eaten, the bones carved, and the wool turned into something more valuable than gold in the cold months, thermal armour for the night. Spinning this wool wasn't just labour, it was lifeblood. Women of the household, often joined by girls learning the craft, worked by firelight with wooden spindles and drop weights, teasing strands into yarn thick enough to last generations. The rhythm of spinning became the background music of winter evenings, the soft hiss of wool sliding through fingers, the creak of the wheel, the low murmur of voices telling stories or trading news. Weaving was slower still. Loom work that stretched for hours, days, sometimes weeks for a single large blanket. But once finished, that blanket would be heavy enough to pin you in place, warm enough to stave off frostbite, and tough enough to endure year after year of smoke, soot, sweat, and snowmelt. These woolen blankets were often paired with furs, thick skins from reindeer, fox, bear, or seal. Unlike the evenly woven wool, furs brought unpredictable softness and texture. Some were used fur side down, against the skin, for warmth and comfort. Others were reversed, fur outward, to trap body heat inside the sleeping space. They were heavy, often stinking faintly of the wild, and they were irreplaceable. One large fur could be the difference between survival and sickness in the depths of winter. Families who lacked good furs might pool their resources to buy one, or trade labour or goods with another household. It wasn't vanity, it was insurance. But most common folk slept in what they could spin, stitch, or skin themselves. Straw stuffing, reused sacks, patched pelts, all fair game. What mattered was insulation, not elegance. Bedding was pieced together like memory quilts, marked by years and seasons. This fur came from the first deer your father hunted. That wool was spun while your mother carried your youngest sibling. A scratchy blanket perhaps, but one infused with lineage. Even the arrangement of layers followed a logic born of countless nights in the cold, Straw or moss underneath, then the sleeper wrapped in a tunic or long nightshirt followed by overlapping furs or cloaks, sometimes stitched together at the corners to form a kind of crude sleeping bag. The heaviest woolen blankets came last, laid over all like weighted protection from the world. In winter, sleepers often huddled close, 2, 3, sometimes more under the same covering. Not for affection, but because human heat trapped beneath those layers created a kind of microclimate. The more bodies, the less cold. And it worked. Tests on replica longhouses and bedding reconstructions show that even when outdoor temperatures fall below freezing, interior warmth, preserved by layers of wool and proximity, can remain comfortably above survival thresholds. Without fire, without electricity, just bodies, breath, and smart use of materials. What's striking is not just the physical warmth, but the psychological comfort these textures brought. After a day of hauling nets, splitting firewood, or trekking miles through snow, sinking into thick layers of wool and fur provided more than just heat. It marked the line between effort and rest, between work and peace. The way the blanket fell across your shoulders, the way the straw crunched slightly beneath you. It told your body, this is where the day ends. And it didn't need to be silent to be restful. In fact, the textures of sound matched those of the bedding. The fire crackled. A goat huffed in its pen. Someone nearby shifted in their furs, releasing a faint scent of pine tar and wool grease. Far from distractions, these were signals. You were not alone, you were part of the system. Warmth, breath, and presence layered over you like protection. Sometimes bedding was shared not by choice, but by necessity. If a storm blew in or someone returned late from a hunt, they might crawl under an occupied blanket without asking. The other sleeper would shift slightly, make room, maybe share a corner of fur. These small gestures spoke volumes: hospitality, kinship, duty. And though comfort was always the goal, it was rarely individual. Comfort was communal. Heat was borrowed and returned. No one owned the warmth entirely. A finely spun blanket might be passed down, patched and repaired, still warm with memory. A favoured fur could be folded into a marriage chest or laid over the lap of a dying elder. These weren't just objects, they were lifelines, time-stamped with survival. And so, when the wind howled through the trees and frost crept along the beams, a Viking did not fear the night. They climbed beneath what their family had made, gathered what warmth they had, and let the weight of fur and wool press them into rest. A rest earned. A rest protected by layer after layer of knowledge, labour and love, woven one thread at a time. As the night deepens, you can feel the weight of the blankets not just on your body, but in your bones. Each fibre, each fold, each layer of fur is heavy with effort. Someone carded that wool with raw, chapped fingers. Someone stitched that seam by firelight while smoke stung their eyes. Someone hunted and skinned the beast that now wraps around your shoulders. There's no such thing as passive comfort here. Everything that keeps you warm has passed through hands that understood both hardship and craftsmanship. Even the straw beneath you is carefully chosen. It might have been harvested in late summer, dried in the open air, and stored in bundles well off the ground to keep it from rot. Before lining the bed platforms, it would have been shaken free of pests, perhaps dusted with dried herbs, wild thyme, sweetgrass, or even juniper needles, to keep mites and lice at bay. The result isn't softness in the way modern people imagine it. It's resilience. Springy enough to lift you off the cold floor, dry enough to stay clean, aromatic enough to create a subtle, comforting scent. And when it breaks down, it's composted, burned, or repurposed. Waste has no place in this world. These bedding materials were not chosen by whim. They were selected through generations of failure, discomfort, sickness, and survival. One winter, someone froze because their furs were too thin. The next, their daughter stitched two together. A boy coughed himself breathless, sleeping near a draught, so his brother dragged a bench to block the wind. Year by year, night by night, these tiny adjustments built a system so tuned to the body and climate that modern design feels clumsy in comparison. Blankets weren't always rectangular or symmetrical. Some were shaped like cloaks with fasteners or slits, designed to wrap around two people and close snugly. Others had pointed corners so they could be tied together at the top, forming a hooded enclosure. It wasn't fashion, it was necessity. Even the colour of the wool mattered. Darker wool, less processed, retained more of its natural oils, making it better for moisture resistance. Lighter wool, when available, was softer but less hardy. Families balanced the two like ingredients in a recipe: a core of rough black wool for strength, a top layer of pale cream for comfort. Some households developed tricks we might call clever, but they'd simply call obvious. A warmed stone tucked under the blanket. A second layer of straw placed only at the foot of the bed to insulate feet. A thick woolen wrap used not as a blanket but as a curtain hung from the rafters to block the worst of the drafts. Even pets had their place. Cats curled in the folds of cloaks, dogs stretched along legs and backs, their body heat as valuable as any fur. These weren't just companions. They were tools of the bedding system, alive, loyal, and warm. What modern bedrooms often fail to recognize is how much the body wants to be part of its environment. Here, the Vikings honored that instinct. They didn't try to erase the cold, they negotiated with it. They didn't flatten their senses with silence and synthetic fabrics. They built a world that responded to every shift in weather, light, and breath. The result wasn't luxury. It was intimacy with nature, with each other, with the structure itself. You could even argue that the bedding wasn't confined to night. It had its uses during waking hours. If a storm rolled in midday, if someone returned sick or exhausted from a journey, they would be layered under furs and allowed to rest. The longhouse wasn't segmented by strict rules of time. Rest was taken when needed, not rationed into artificial units. A nap near the hearth after hours of weaving was not laziness. Elders often slept during the day, their bodies no longer tethered to the exact rhythms of work. Children, exhausted from snow play, would vanish beneath a fir, nap for an hour, then rise with red cheeks and tangled hair. And if someone died, their blanket might be passed to a sibling or set aside, not burned. That energy wasn't discarded. It was remembered. Some believed that the furs held the scent of the departed for weeks after, a comfort, a haunt, a reminder. Blankets told stories long after their original owners had vanished. That patch came from a cloak your grandmother wore. That seam was stitched during a blizzard when no one left the house for 10 days straight. You're not just sleeping under fabric, you're sleeping under memory. The same reverence extended to repairs. Vikings didn't discard bedding when it tore, they mended it. And those mends weren't hidden, they were worn like scars. A wool patch on a fur lining was evidence of endurance. A mismatched stitch meant someone cared enough to preserve it. Sometimes, patches bore symbols, runes for protection, charms for warmth, even the carved initials of the one who had sewn it. These weren't embellishments, they were guardians. Your bedding didn't just keep you warm, it watched over you. And so, when the wind hisses through the thatch and the walls creak with ice, you pull the furs tighter. You don't fear the night. You know that the things around you were crafted with hands that knew cold intimately and refused to be broken by it. You know that every layer you wrap around your body is a response to 1,000 winters. You are not alone in your rest. You are surrounded by care, by design, by the soft weight of history pressing down like snow on a quiet roof. Chapter 4. Soundscapes of safety, animals, crackling fires, and midnight murmurs. Beneath the layers of wool and fur, with your cheek pressed against rough cloth that still holds the scent of ash and lanolin, you notice something that doesn't register at first. Not silence, but a carefully arranged orchestra of sound. It's in the background, but it's constant, and it's no accident. A soft shuffle of straw under someone's heel. A low, rhythmic snore from a heavy-set man a few feet away. The whisper of wind outside, broken and reshaped by moss-stuffed beams. And somewhere to your left, the unmistakable creak of a goat shifting in its sleep, its hooves thudding softly against the floor. All of it together is not just noise, it's reassurance. Silence, in this world, is not peaceful. It's threatening. It means the fire has died, or the animals have frozen, or worse, something has gone wrong beyond the timber walls. Silence here is not absence, it's a warning. That's why Viking longhouses were designed to hold and reflect sound in a way that created comfort. You were never alone in the dark. The breath of others, the rustle of fabric, the distant yawn of a sleeping child. These weren't distractions. They were lifelines. Even the fire played its part in this living lullaby. The pop of sap, the hiss of green wood, the low hum of embers shifting. These sounds stitched the night together. A good fire was like a second heartbeat for the household. Not roaring, but alive. It didn't need to fill the space, just warm it with presence. People could sleep through blizzards, but a suddenly quiet hearth would wake even the deepest dreamer. It was instinctive. Your body knew when the soundscape changed, and it responded before thought could intervene. And then there were the animals, not just tolerated, but essential. Cows, goats, chickens, even the occasional pig slept close to the living quarters, separated only by low partitions or, in some cases, nothing at all. Their warmth radiated into the room, but so did their sounds. The steady breathing of a cow is like a low drum beat in the bones of the house. Dogs reposition themselves with heavy sighs, sometimes resting their heads on a child's leg or curling up beside a pregnant woman for extra warmth. These sounds weren't masked or blocked, they were embraced. Modern life teaches you to seek silence. Earplugs, white noise machines, double-glazed windows, anything to shut out the world. But here, sound was part of the architecture of sleep. You wanted to hear it. You needed to. It told you where you were, who was near, and whether the world outside was behaving. If the wind was howling too loud, or if a horse stamped more than once, or if a dog barked sharply, then maybe someone would sit up, rub their eyes, reach for a blade. Even conversation had its place in this soundscape. Not loud, not disruptive, but soft, fragmentary talk between those not quite ready to sleep or those woken gently by a dream. A child might ask about the stars they saw before coming in, and an elder might whisper the story of a fox who ran across the sky to chase the sun. A woman might murmur a verse she remembered from her grandmother. A man might hum low under his breath. Not a song, but a rhythm, something familiar enough to make the mind go slack and heavy. These weren't planned moments. They drifted in and out of the night like smoke. Laughter, too, found its way into the dark. Joke retold from dinner, a teasing nudge, a shared memory that still held warmth. And when the laughter died down, the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was shared. You didn't fall asleep in isolation. You were folded into the house itself, into its breath, its noise, its warmth. Sometimes a baby cried. Sometimes a goat bleated sharply. Someone might cough, roll over, bump the wall. But none of it broke the spell. The body knew the difference between disruptive and familiar. The sounds of the longhouse were like a song you'd heard since birth. You knew every note, every pause. And so, instead of rousing fear or irritation, they pulled you deeper into rest. The sound of the fire became a signal for dreams. Children drifted off, staring into the orange light, watching shapes move in the soot-black beams overhead. Faces, creatures, ships and stormy seas. Adults lay with eyes closed, letting the rise and fall of embers shape the rhythm of their thoughts. Even dreams, it seemed, had their own acoustics. People woke and remembered not just the images but the sounds. The cracking tree, the rushing water, the words spoken by a voice they didn't recognize. Dreams here weren't cut off from waking. They were threaded through the night's living soundtrack. And if someone woke at a strange hour, neither night nor morning, but the cold grey space between, they didn't panic or rush to return to sleep. They listened first to the house, then to their own breath, then to whatever stirred beyond the walls. A moment of silence might stretch just long enough to make you wonder. Then a log shifted in the fire. Someone snored. The dog groaned in its sleep. A chance to tuck the blanket tighter, to add another fur, to check that the child's feet were still warm. Maybe someone whispered a short prayer to Thor or Frasier before lying back down. Not loudly, not for ceremony, just a line or two, barely more than a breath, offered to the dark in exchange for safety. Sleep returned, not with effort, but with gravity. It pulled you back down into the warmth, into the weave of voices, fires, footsteps, and soft animal breath. There were no earplugs, no quiet hours enforced by clock or neighbour. Just this. Sound as comfort, sound as structure, sound as memory passed down through generations of long nights and longer winters. It only needed to remain alive. The fire flares gently, responding to a hand that's reached out in the dark to feed it one more log. The motion is almost silent, no rustle of blankets, no speech. Just the hush of practiced movement, someone who knows exactly which wood burns slowest and how to keep the room warm without waking anyone. A faint snap of bark, a bloom of orange light behind closed eyes, and then the fire settles again. Not too bright, not too loud, just alive. That's the point. In this world, the goal isn't silence, it's signal. The house speaks through its many layers of life. A squeal of straw beneath someone turning over. the hiss of sap in the wood, the thick breathing of a cow who's eaten well and laid down to chew the night away. To live in a Viking longhouse is to accept that sleep doesn't come in isolation. It arrives in waves, shared across bodies and boards and beams. Everyone is listening, even while they sleep. Some sounds are coded. The sharp stamp of a horse could mean ice cracking somewhere along the roof. The brief, higher bleat of a goat might suggest something stirring near the fence outside. A sleeper near the door might sit up and listen harder, not with fear, just with readiness. If nothing follows, they lay back down. If something does, the sleeping pattern shifts. Someone closer to the door will rise, cloak thrown over one shoulder, blade in hand, to investigate. The others don't wake fully. They know the sounds, the roles, the order. A house like this is not protected by walls alone. It is guarded by familiarity. In complete darkness, everyone knows where everyone is. The sound of a foot on the floor, even a cough, is mapped instantly. You could follow it, eyes shut, to its source. That's because these sounds repeat every night. The man by the door always shifts 3 times before sleep takes him. The child near the goat pens hums for a while and then stops suddenly. The elder closest to the hearth sometimes talks in his sleep, mixing real names with those of long-dead gods. You know these things, you've heard them 100 times. And then there's the whisper. Not always words, just a sound passed between 2 people sharing the same fur. A wife reminding her husband of something to be done in the morning. A father soothing a child without waking them fully. 2 boys laughing into their hands over something that happened earlier that day. These tiny sounds don't disturb the room. They belong to it, like sparks too small to burn, but warm enough to feel. They remind everyone that this space, for all its rough edges and bitter winds, is still human. The animals are part of that humanity. The dog who sleeps pressed against someone's back has a rhythm of his own. He stretches twice during the night. He groans once, then he's still. His warmth is unmistakable, his loyalty even more so. He doesn't bark unless he must. He knows the sounds too. A stranger's step versus a storm's howl. A rabbit outside the door versus something heavier. He listens while others rest. That's his role. The chickens murmur. The pig snorts in sleep. If something disturbs them, the household will stir. If they're quiet, so is everyone else. It's a delicate web built over generations. A house not made of bricks and beams alone, but of shared trust in what sounds mean and when they mean nothing. The floor creaks slightly. Someone has gone to relieve themselves outside. No one moves. They know the pattern. A pause at the door, a cold rush of air, the shuffle of feet on packed snow. Then a return, a tug of blanket, a sigh. All normal, all expected. This choreography is not taught. It's absorbed. You grow up in it, breathe it, carry it with you even when you're old enough to sleep near the hearth. And if one night a sound doesn't fit, something hollow or broken or out of rhythm, it cuts through everything. One mismatched sound and half the room wakes. No one shouts, no one panics. They just rise, slowly, alert. The tension lasts only seconds. Maybe it was the roof settling, maybe not, but the house waits until it knows, until the sounds return to their pattern. Then the breathing slows again, eyes close. The murmur of sleep resumes. This is a kind of music, not the kind made for dancing or feasting, but a quiet, continuous song that plays only for those within the walls. Outsiders wouldn't hear it the same way. They might complain that the house never really goes quiet, that there's always something, a snore, a creak, a grunt, a spark. But that's the point. Silence means absence. Instead, Viking sleep embraced the world as it was. You didn't fight the sound, you slept in it, with it. Because the longhouse was a living thing, and its sounds were your proof that everything still held together, that you hadn't lost anyone, that the world outside hadn't broken through, that your people were still breathing beside you even if you couldn't see them. Sometimes, if a child cried out in a dream, they weren't scolded. A hand would find their back. A voice, barely louder than the fire, would offer something familiar, a fragment of story, a name, a lullaby, just enough to anchor them, to bring them back. And once they drifted off again, that voice would fade into the background hum of a house that never sleeps entirely. The knowledge carried in these soundscapes doesn't come from instruction. It comes from time. From years spent curled under the same blankets, listening to the same footsteps, the same breath. A child who knows nothing of architecture could still tell you which beam groans when the snow is too heavy. A woman could tell by the goat's breathing whether she'll need to wake early and warm extra water. These are not guesses. They're inherited perceptions, passed down the way others pass down heirlooms. So when you lie there now, your eyes closed, your muscles loose from warmth and exhaustion, you don't need to check if everything's in place. You can hear it. The dog sighs. Boulder stirs, mutters something about a mountain. Someone chuckles low. Someone snores. The fire answers with its own reply, steady and low. It's all still here, and that means you can sleep, not because it's quiet, but because the noise is right. Chapter 5. Darkness is medicine, how endless winter nights fuel deep sleep. The glow of the hearth has faded into a dull red ember. Outside, the wind no longer howls. It whispers, patient and slow, curling along the roof like a finger tracing old scars. Presses close on all sides, thick and absolute. Not the soft dimness of a curtained bedroom, but a deep, consuming black that stretches unbroken for hours, sometimes days. This is winter at its fullest. And for the Vikings, it wasn't an inconvenience, it was a gift, a seasonal slowing of the world, a return to something primal. In the lands close to the Arctic Circle, winter does not simply visit, it settles in. Daylight shrinks until it barely flickers across the horizon for an hour or two, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The rest of the time belongs to the dark. The longhouse becomes more than a shelter, it turns into a cocoon. People move slower, speak softer, rise later. It is not laziness, it is alignment. Nature quiets itself in the cold, and so do those who live within it. The human body listens, if allowed, and in Viking homes there was no war against the season. There was surrender. Sleep, in these months, came in long waves, not the rigid 8 hours modern society prescribes, but a flexible rhythm marked by rising and resting, often more than once per night. You might sleep for 5 hours, wake briefly, tend to the fire, whisper a few words, share warmth, then drift off again for another stretch of rest. Some called it segmented sleep. For the Vikings, it was simply life. The darkness gave them time to dream deeply, to recover, to heal, and they didn't question. They followed the slow arc of the season with their eyes closed. The body responds differently in this kind of darkness. Without artificial light, the pineal gland triggers melatonin naturally, early and in abundance. The brain slows. The limbs grow heavier. The breath deepens. The mind loosens its grip. You are not dragged into sleep. You are cradled into it. Vikings didn't need theories or supplements to explain this. They knew only that winter was the season when even the strongest beasts huddled down, when the earth itself seemed to rest. Why should they fight what every instinct told them to obey? Even their diet adjusted to support the darkness. Heavier meals, fat-rich and slow to digest, kept bodies fueled through the long nights. Warm broth, dried meats, root vegetables, and thick stews. These weren't just calories, they were anchors. After eating, the fire dimmed, the fur blankets pulled tighter, and sleep came not as a duty, but as a destination, a place to fall into, safely and slowly, until the mind unspooled into dreams that could last until the next dusk. Some nights, no one stirred for hours. The fire burned down to its bones, the animals stopped moving, the wind fell silent. A kind of suspended time wrapped the household, no clocks, no urgency, just rest. A full-body stillness that might last 12 hours, sometimes more. No guilt, no self-judgment. In fact, to deny this kind of sleep was foolish. It meant sickness, fatigue, even death. The wise embraced it. They treated it as the medicine it was. Darkness wasn't feared, it was trusted. You learned to see within it, not with your eyes, but with familiarity. You could find the water jug in pitch black, feel the texture of the floor beneath your feet, reach for your child's blanket and know, by weight and smell, that it belonged to them. Light was not necessary. Awareness replaced it. The fire wasn't just for vision. It was for warmth, rhythm, reassurance. And dreams in this darkness, those were different, longer, wilder. Something about the way time stretched in the night made dreams feel more real, less fragmented. People remembered them more clearly. They discussed them over morning broth. They debated whether dreams had meanings or messages. If you saw a raven fly backward, Did it mean war was coming? If you walked through snow without leaving footprints, was someone watching you from the other side? Some believed these were just fragments of thought. Others believed the gods spoke in symbols when the world was most quiet. But no one dismissed the idea that the long dark allowed for deeper visions. Children were told that the night itself was alive, that it listened to your breathing, that it tucked you in. It was not a threat, but a companion. If you feared it, it would only... But if you welcomed it, it would wrap around you like a second blanket. There were rituals, simple ones. Turning toward the hearth before lying down, running fingers across a carved charm placed at the bedside, whispering a word to a loved one, just in case you dreamed of them. These weren't superstitions. They were acknowledgements. That sleep in the dark was something sacred. Even the sick were treated differently in winter. They were placed closer to the fire, surrounded by the warmest bodies, given the richest food, the thickest furs. Sleep was encouraged as the first form of healing. Not herbs, not prayers, though those came too, but rest, real rest. Deep enough to slow the pulse and let the body speak to itself. Wounds closed faster. Fevers broke sooner. The body knew what to do, if only it was allowed the time to do it. And time was what winter gave in abundance. You had no excuse not to sleep, no fields to plough, no distant markets to reach, no journeys safe to make, just the house, the fire, and the dark, for weeks. And instead of fighting that, the Vikings leaned in. They used it, they honoured it. When morning finally did come, and often that word didn't mean much more than a shift from black to dark blue, it brought no alarm, just the slow return of motion. A whisper, a stretch, the crunch of boots on straw, the fire stoked back to life. No one leapt out of bed, no one shook the others awake. You stirred as you were ready. You returned from the long dark like a swimmer rising slowly from deep water, and you carried with you the calm of a night where nothing had been rushed, nothing wasted, everything held. You wake not because you have to, but because your body says it's time. There is no bell, no siren, no schedule pinned to the wall, just a quiet stirring in the air, a slight shift in light, the faint return of blue to the edges of the world. The fire beside you is low but still alive, exhaling soft heat across your blankets. Around you, the others remain still, some breathing deep, some curled like cats, others half-stirred, listening for sounds that confirm the world hasn't changed. It hasn't. The longhouse holds, the wind has softened, the darkness begins its slow retreat. Even now, as the season drags on, the rhythm hasn't grown tedious. Winter isn't something to be endured. It's a cycle, a signal. The body and the land speaking the same slow language. You've grown used to the extra sleep, the way it stretches and folds itself around the day. And when you wake in the middle of the night, which still happens, you don't fight it. You sit up slowly. You adjust a blanket. You might whisper a word to someone beside you, or pad barefoot to the fire and nudge a log into place. You don't ask why you're awake. You just are, and that's enough. These in-between hours, when sleep has loosened its grip, but the day hasn't yet claimed you, are sacred. Time moves differently here. You might spend it staring into the coals, watching faces form and vanish in the orange glow. You might listen to the rhythm of breathing around you, noting who snores, who murmurs, who shifted closer to the heat. You might think of a dream, a strange one, with snow that burned or a voice that wasn't your own. Or you might think of nothing at all. Just feel your body settle again into warmth and let yourself fall back, like a stone slipping beneath the surface of a quiet lake. This kind of sleep-layered, broken, rich is unfamiliar to modern minds. We've come to believe that uninterrupted sleep is the only sleep worth having, that waking up mid-cycle is a failure, that hours should be counted, tracked, optimized. The Vikings knew otherwise. Their rest wasn't clocked, it was lived, not in one block, but in waves, not in silence, but in presence. Their sleep was part of the day, not separate from it. It reflected the season, the weather, the state of the house. If the fire burned long and the room stayed warm, sleep came easy. If a storm blew in, or an animal stirred too much, it changed the night's pattern. No shame in that, no panic, just adjustment, response, trust. And the darkness made it all possible. That long, uninterrupted span of night gave permission to rest deeply and often. to turn inward, to reset. No one thought themselves weak for sleeping more in winter. No one bragged about waking early. These weren't virtues. They were interruptions. You didn't rise before the sun unless you had to. You didn't cut the dark short unless something urgent pulled you up. The night was allowed to run its course, and those who honoured that cycle stayed healthier, clearer, stronger. They weathered the winter not just with bodies intact, but with minds calm and steady. Children especially were watched closely in these months. Their growth depended on warmth and rest. They were given extra furs, placed between adults for maximum heat. If a child stirred too often, or talked in their sleep or woke crying, it wasn't dismissed. It was noted. Someone would adjust their bedding, whisper a word, maybe offer a carved charm to hold through the night. Sleep wasn't treated as a child's obligation. It was a form of care, a shield, a space in which they could grow without fear. Even the adults carried rituals into their rest. Not formal prayers necessarily, but habits that bordered on sacred, wrapping the same fur in the same way, laying a hand across their chest, or against the wall beam, or toward the fire. Small gestures repeated so many times they became invisible, but they mattered. They were anchors in the sea of night. Each person had their own way of entering sleep, and each one, in their own way, emerged from it in the morning with the knowledge that they had been held, not just by fabric and fire, but by structure, by tradition, by quiet and patience and trust. As spring crept closer, the night would slowly loosen its grip. The days would stretch. The rhythm would change. But for now, in the deep belly of winter, this dark was everything. It swallowed the outside world. It made the house the only universe that mattered. And within that universe, sleep ruled, not as an escape, but as a cycle of renewal, a place to retreat, not because the day was too much, but because the body needed a place to recover, a way to listen inward, to mend what had been worn in silence and warmth and shadow. In those moments just before sleep returned, you'd often hear something soft, far away, but clear, a hum, a low chant. Someone across the room, not fully awake, not fully dreaming, maybe a song they learned as a child, maybe just a melody their mind held on to from a long ago night like this one. You'd hear it and not be startled. You'd let it wash over you like a tide rising, and then you'd let go, not to nothing, but to the night itself, which was never empty, only full of memory, of warmth, of the slow, careful quiet that waits for no one and welcomes all. Chapter 6. The last breath before falling asleep doesn't always lead to silence. Sometimes it leads elsewhere, to rivers that run backward, mountains that speak, or skies split open with fire. For the Vikings, these weren't just dreams, they were messages, portents, a language of symbols that echoed beyond the hearth, deep into the spirit, and they weren't taken lightly. In a world where gods walked among men and fate was threaded long before birth, the realm of sleep was not private. No one needed to be told this. It was known, passed down through stories, gestures, and instinct. A dream could change a day. It could delay a voyage, send warriors a different route, or cause a marriage to be postponed. If a chieftain dreamed of drowning, he might stay inland for a week. If a woman dreamed of fire licking at her child's feet, she might keep him from wandering too far from the longhouse. These weren't seen as weakness or superstition. They were caution, a kind of listening, because dreams were not just figments of the mind. They were the echoes of something older. The gods, it was said, didn't shout, they whispered, and they did so when the body was at rest, when the room was still, when the world outside had gone quiet enough for meaning to rise through the cracks. A message might come as a vision, clear, vivid, unforgettable, or it might come as confusion, layered symbols that only made sense days later, when something happened that matched the feeling from the night. Either way, it was paid attention to. There were those who dreamed more often, more vividly. They weren't called prophets. They were simply known. You might not say it aloud, but everyone understood who had the gift. An elder who saw his brother's death days before it came. A young girl who dreamed of a red fox the night before the harvest failed. These people weren't feared. They were listened to. Not every night, not always. But when something felt too sharp, too real, too thick with meaning, it was remembered. And if a dream came during the long winter sleep, it carried more weight. These were not dreams born in rush or anxiety. They were slow, shaped by deep rest, stretched out across hours of warmth and stillness. They had colour, texture, sound. And when someone woke and said, "I saw a tree burning in snow," people didn't dismiss it. They asked questions. What side did it burn from? Was there a voice? Did you smell anything? Dreams were investigated like tracks in snow, evidence that something had passed through. Even children's dreams were sometimes treated with reverence. If a boy described a bear who spoke in a voice like his grandmother's, the adults didn't laugh. They might pass a hand over his head, murmur a quiet word of protection, and make sure he was given the warmer blanket that night. The dream might mean nothing, or it might mean everything. No one could be sure, and that uncertainty required humility. To mock the message of the gods was to court misfortune. Better to listen, better to wait. There were patterns, of course. Dreams of water often meant danger. Dreams of wolves could be strength or betrayal, depending on their number. Falling was rare and feared. It suggested a breaking of something foundational. Flight, though, was less alarming. Some believed the soul wandered during sleep, and that dreams of flying were simply memories of where it had gone. Places the body couldn't reach, but the spirit could. Mountains in the distance. Forests thick with animals not seen in years. Shores lined with ships made of light. These weren't always fantasy. Sometimes someone would later travel and find that place exactly as seen. Nightmares held their own weight. Not every dark dream was evil. Fear in sleep might be a warning, or a challenge, or a cleansing. But if someone woke too many nights screaming, if their dreams pulled blood from their nose or left them trembling in daylight, the household would take action. Not with medicine, but with ritual. A carved charm laid beneath the blanket. A whispered chant traced across the forehead. A story told backwards. Nothing showy, nothing loud. Just enough to tilt the balance, to reset the unseen thread that had gone crooked. Even the way people slept reflected their relationship to dreams. Some lay flat, open to visions. Others curled inward, trying to block them. A person might face the fire one night and the wall the next, depending on what they hoped or feared to see. Pillows were rare, but when used they were chosen carefully, not too high, not too soft. Just enough to cradle the head without blocking the flow of breath or thought. And always, somewhere nearby, an object from waking life, something to pull you back in case the dream pulled too hard, because that was the fear. Not that dreams would come, but that they might not let go, that the spirit would wander too far, find something too beautiful or too terrible, and refuse to return. And so, precautions were taken. A bracelet worn to bed, a hand resting lightly on another's arm, a child nestled between parents. Thin threads of presence, meant to tether the sleeper to the living world. Yet not all dreams were warnings. Some were gifts. A reunion with someone long lost, a glimpse of spring during the coldest week of winter. A moment of clarity about a problem that had hung heavy for days. These dreams were cherished, told aloud, savoured. They weren't just mental noise, they were wisdom from the deeper self, from the gods, from the ancestors, from the earth. You might wake and say, "I walked with my mother last night, though she's been gone 3 winters." No one would challenge you. They would ask where you walked, what she said, whether her hands felt warm, because that kind of dream isn't dismissed. It's honoured, not as proof of magic, but as evidence that something remains, that love lingers, that sleep holds more than rest, it holds memory. As the long night continues, so do the dreams. You drift in and out, sometimes pulled by warmth, sometimes by sound, sometimes by nothing at all. Each time you return with something different, a feeling, an image, a word that wasn't yours before. You may forget it by morning, or it may stay with you forever. A tree burning in snow, a ship made of bone, a whisper that says your name in a voice you haven't heard in years. And when you wake, the fire still burns, the house still breathes, the dog shifts beside you, and the dream, whatever it was, is now part of the night, stored in the wood, in the walls, in the place where the gods still walk when the world is asleep. The smell of the fire lingers in your hair when you wake from a dream you don't entirely understand. Not frightening, not joyful, just strange. A river running uphill, a wolf made of mist, a child's voice speaking in a language you don't recognize. You open your eyes slowly. The roof beams are still above you. The warmth of others still presses along your side. Nothing has changed, and yet the feeling doesn't leave. That's how it is with some dreams. They don't vanish with morning. They hang on as if they're waiting for something. You don't tell anyone right away. Not out of fear or shame, just caution. Dreams are slippery when spoken too soon. Best to sit with them. Let them settle. Maybe by midday the meaning will come, or maybe it will wait until something outside. A tree falling, a crow circling matches the image in your mind and brings it into focus. The Vikings didn't rush to decode these experiences. Dreams were part of the long rhythm of life, like the tides or the seasons. They moved at their own pace, but they mattered. Every dream added another thread to the vast, invisible tapestry of fate. The Norse, 3 sisters who wove the destiny of gods and men, were said to spin those threads endlessly. Some believed dreams were echoes of their work, the loose ends of threads brushing against your mind while you slept. A tangled dream meant something unresolved. A vivid one meant something was near. A dream without memory, nothing but a blur, was its own kind of message too. Not all silence is empty. When you finally share your dream, it's not in front of a crowd. Just one person, maybe 2, someone who knows you, someone who's heard your dreams before. You speak low, not to keep it secret, but to respect its weight. You don't embellish, you don't interpret too quickly, you just tell it like it was, where you were, what you saw, what you felt, and then you wait. The other person might nod, might ask a question. They don't try to fix it. They just hold it with you, like one more log placed on the fire. Not to burn away the dream, but to keep it warm enough to live. Some dreams do demand action. A warning about a coming storm, a face you haven't seen in years, smiling with urgency. These are not dismissed. They are considered. Maybe you delay a trip. Maybe you watch the sky more carefully. Maybe you speak to someone you've been avoiding. The point isn't to let the dream rule your life, but to recognize that it has entered it and deserves a seat at the table, especially when the dream comes more than once. Repetition gives dreams power. If the same image appears 3 nights in a row, even the most skeptical man will start to listen. A raven circling, well overflowing, fire in the east, symbols, not sentences. But symbols can outlast words. They travel better through time. Not all dreams are symbolic, though. Some are blunt. You see a man fall in battle. The next week he does. You dream of a ship cracking in half, and 2 months later you hear it happened on the open sea. These dreams are rare, but they're remembered. They pass from person to person, even across generations. Your grandmother once dreamed of wolves the night before the raiders came. Your uncle saw a tree fall on your father before it happened. These stories aren't told with fear. They're told with reverence, a reminder that the night knows more than we do. Even the gods themselves dream. Odin, the All-Father, gave up an eye for wisdom, but it said he gained just as much in sleep. His dreams were visions, full of fire and fate. He saw Ragnarok, the end of the world, long before it arrived, and he didn't run from it. He prepared. That's how dreams worked for the gods, and for the people who followed them. Not as prophecy to escape, but as guidance to navigate. You didn't fight your dreams, you learned from them. Of course, there were days when a dream haunted someone, not because it was violent or confusing, but because it felt too real, as if part of them hadn't returned. These people might seem distant the next morning, slow to speak, caught between here and there. That's when the rituals came in. Small ones, a bowl of water left by the bed, a charm moved from one beam to another, a story told backwards at dusk. These weren't cures, they were recalibrations, not to erase the dream, but to help the person find their place again. For those who lived with these dreams often, those who felt more than they wanted to, there was a kind of quiet respect. People didn't tease them or push them for answers. They gave them space, listened more carefully, watched how they reacted to things. These dreamers were sometimes the first to notice a shift in the weather, or a crack in the ice, or the way a stranger's smile didn't reach his eyes. Not because they were magical, but because they'd trained themselves, in sleep, to see what others missed. And then there were the collective dreams. Nights when several people woke with similar images in their minds: a forest burning, a woman in red, a storm that swallowed the sky. These dreams spread through the house like wind through thatch, silent at first, then everywhere. People didn't panic, but they paid attention. When the night sends the same image to many, it is no longer personal, it is communal. A message not for one person, but for the group. And so they acted together, changed plans, moved supplies, watched each other more closely, because the dream had chosen them all. In spring, the dreams changed. They became lighter, faster, more flashes than stories. As if the world outside, now bright and loud again, didn't leave as much room for deep messages. But winter returned, always, and with it came the long nights, the thick sleep, and the dreams that stretched for hours and left footprints behind. Dreams that meant something. And so, as the room stirs again and morning begins to press against the windows, you carry the dream with you. Not as a burden, but as a companion. Maybe you'll understand it tomorrow, maybe not for years. But it's yours now. Part of your breath, part of the house. One more thread in the weave of who you are and who you're becoming. The first thing you feel when waking in a Viking longhouse during deep winter isn't sound or light. It's temperature. Cold air brushes against the tip of your nose, your cheeks, maybe your fingertips if they slipped out from under the furs. It's crisp, dry, and carries with it the sharp purity of untouched snow and pine sap. But beneath the layered weight of wool, fur, and the slow-burning heat of your own breath, the rest of your body is steeped in warmth. This contrast, cool at the edges, hot at the core, isn't uncomfortable. It's perfect. It's designed. Inside the longhouse was never still. It moved, pushed and pulled gently by the low flames of the hearth, by the breath of sleepers, by the gaps in the moss-sealed timber walls. But it was never completely sealed off, and that was intentional. While the fire warmed the space and bodies trapped heat, a touch of cold was always allowed in. Not enough to chill the bones, but enough to keep the space fresh. The Vikings understood this balance, not as theory, but through experience, through generations of waking rested or waking sick, of fires built too big or too small, of nights spent tossing in heat or freezing in stillness. Today we'd call this thermal zoning. They didn't have the term, they didn't need it. What they had was intuition, sharpened by the stakes of survival. Cold air near the nose and mouth kept breathing easy and circulation strong. If the entire room had been hot, oxygen would grow stale, the body sluggish, but too cold and no one could sleep. So they layered not just their beds, but their entire environment. Warm bodies, warm bedding, cool air, an ecosystem of sleep, their materials made it possible. Wool, especially, wasn't just a textile, it was a living shield. The lanolin left in unwashed wool repelled moisture, resisted mold, and locked in heat even when damp. The way it was woven tight, dense, coarse, meant that even a single layer could trap warmth against the skin. Add fur on top of that with its uneven, insulating nap, and you had something better than modern down. Heavier, yes, but heavier was good. It told the body, you are still, you are safe, you are not moving again until morning. But perhaps the most brilliant part of this system was its flexibility. You didn't have one blanket, you had layers. Thin ones for fall, thick ones for deep winter. Spare pelts for guests or for doubling up when storms hit. And you adjusted them not with thermostats or timers, but with instinct. A hand pulled a layer tighter. A body shifted closer to the fire. If someone grew too warm, they shifted a fur aside. If the baby's feet felt cold, someone tucked straw around them. The entire system was responsive but not reactive. No one panicked over discomfort. They simply changed something small and immediate. The construction of the longhouse played a role too. Its high, curved roof allowed smoke to rise and escape slowly while holding heat closer to the ground. The thick log walls, stuffed with moss, held warmth without sealing it in too tightly. A central fire, always tended, meant radiant heat pulsed outward, not just warming the air, but heating the stones and floorboards themselves. In some homes, these warmed surfaces retained heat well into the night, creating what we'd now call passive heating. And then, of course, there were the bodies. In modern sleep science, we talk about core temperature and how it drops before sleep. The Vikings knew this by feel. That's why they lay close family members, animals, even strangers during travel. Body heat wasn't awkward. It was essential. And it wasn't just the heat you gave, it was the heat you saved by receiving someone else's. 2 people could sleep with 1 layer. 3 with the same. Heat compounded, not linearly but exponentially. The more bodies, the less you needed anything else. Even how they slept mattered. Curled tightly, limbs tucked, head low. This posture minimized surface area, slowed heat loss, and allowed the furs to do their job. In the deepest cold, people slept face to face, breath shared between them under the same covering. Some kept pets near their feet, not out of fondness, though that existed, but because the dog's body was another small furnace. In fact, many people preferred to sleep with a dog curled along their back. They called it smart. And it was. Cold was not the enemy. It was part of the equation. It kept pests at bay, discouraged disease, and made the hearth more effective. Without that surrounding chill, the fire would smother or overheat the space. But with the right balance, it became the center of a carefully tuned system. And when everything was right, fire steady, bedding layered, bodies close, air clean, you didn't just sleep. You sank. You dissolved into the night. The Vikings didn't talk about circadian rhythms. They didn't need clocks or studies to confirm what their bodies already knew. Sleep came easily because the environment demanded it. Darkness fell, cold crept in, the fire was lit, food was eaten, and then the body obeyed. There were no battles with insomnia, no glow of lanterns or urgency to finish tasks late into the night. When the world said stop, they stopped, and when it said rise, they rose. The cold trained them, but it also freed them from the illusions of control, from the war against fatigue, from the idea that being tired was a failure. It wasn't. It was the truth of the season, and in that truth they thrived. Morning brought no grogginess, no resentment, just the slow re-entry into a world where everything had its place. Cold, warmth, silence, sound, work and sleep. You could feel your own body working with, not against, the structure you lived in. You felt alive, not in spite of the environment, but because of your place within it. That's the lesson that lingers, even now. That a good sleep isn't a product you buy. It's a relationship you build with the cold, with your space, with your own breath. The Vikings didn't master sleep by eliminating discomfort. They mastered it by understanding what the body needs when the world outside is unforgiving. And instead of hiding from that world, they invited it in just enough to remind them they were alive. By the time the morning frost began to retreat from the edges of the thatched roof, the longhouse had already begun to hum with the soft rustlings of life. But even in this gentle waking, the precision of the Viking sleep environment remained in place, its balance never entirely disturbed. One might toss back a fur or stretch a stiff arm toward the warm coals at the hearth's edge, but the house itself remained a sleeping body, slow to move, cautious not to break its own rhythm. In many ways, the house learned from its sleepers, just as they had learned from the house. Not every longhouse was the same, of course. Along the coast, where sea winds battered the eaves, some were dug half into the earth to trap geothermal warmth. Inland, in regions where snow would bury doorways, rooftops were angled and insulated more thickly, using layers of turf stacked over birch bark and beams. But the principle remained: protection from extremes, not isolation from nature. Heat was precious, that so was breath. You needed both to survive the winter, and to sleep through it. And winter did not mean short nights, far from it. For entire months in the northern regions, darkness ruled most hours of the day. Without sunlight to anchor the body's sense of time, one might assume chaos. But what emerged instead was a deepening of circadian wisdom. Longer sleeps, mid-evening waking, even segmented sleep, where a first and second sleep bookended a brief period of wakefulness. Some used that time to stoke the fire, check on livestock, or speak softly with whoever else had stirred. These moments were not viewed as insomnia, but as natural. The body was not broken. It was following its own winter path. This interlude between sleeps, now confirmed by historians and sleep scientists alike, was fertile ground for thought, memory, and even intimacy. A time when dreams bled into waking life, when stories were whispered instead of told, and when the mind, no longer burdened by the day's urgency, wandered freely. If anything, these twilight hours became the soul of Viking nights, a quiet time of listening, to the wind, to the crackle of oak sap in the fire, to one's own heart, slowed and softened by darkness. Temperature cycles played a subtle but vital role in these patterns. As the hearth dimmed through the night, body temperatures dropped in response. Melatonin surged naturally in the cooler air, deepening sleep. And when a sleeper stirred toward dawn, often it was not because they were fully rested, but because the temperature had dropped too low. This prompted another log to be placed on the fire, or a shift in position, or a drawing closer to the warmth of others. The entire sleep experience became dynamic, a dialogue, not a passive state. Even dreams, those cryptic night stories, were shaped by this climate. Research now shows that cooler environments increase the vividness of dreams and reduce the frequency of nightmares. The Vikings didn't need data to tell them that. They knew that dreams from overheated sleep were often restless and confusing, while those from cool, comforted slumber were prophetic or profound. And since dreams were believed to be messages, from ancestors, from gods, from the unseen world, their clarity mattered. Dreams were sacred. The room in which they formed had to be balanced enough to allow their full shape to emerge. The balance extended even into noise. Silence in a Viking longhouse was never total. Wind, shifting animals, the slow settling of timber beams, all these sounds wove themselves into sleep. But jarring noise, sudden clangs, or disturbances were carefully minimized. Children were taught to move quietly at night. Pots and tools were arranged to avoid accidental clangs. Even when celebrating late, those who stayed up drank by the hearth, speaking low, the way one does in a church or around a sickbed. The sanctity of sleep was unspoken but universally honored. Sleep wasn't an escape from labor, it was part of labor. A good night's rest meant better work at dawn. A tired man slept with his axe. A tired woman kneaded poor dough. A tired lookout missed the sign of raiders. Everyone had seen what lack of sleep did. It stole judgment, made tempers short, cracked the thin ice of community. So they guarded it, not with anxiety, but with intention, by building habits that encouraged depth, warmth, and stillness, by adjusting rituals with the seasons, and by trusting the body more than the clock. Among the most curious aspects of this system was the relationship between fire and air. In modern terms, fire consumes oxygen and releases carbon monoxide, a deadly combination in closed spaces. But Viking longhouses weren't airtight. The gaps in their construction, the thatched roofs, the unsealed beams all allowed air exchange, preventing the build-up of dangerous gases. What seemed like primitive construction was in fact protective. The drafty roof, the chinked walls, even the animal skins covering the doors. They weren't just about insulation or access. They were about airflow, about balance. And that balance saved lives without anyone writing a treatise on ventilation. Even the act of waking was not abrupt. No buzzing alarms or harsh bells, just the slow brightening of the interior. The way the fire shifted as someone stoked it. The murmur of someone rising, the creak of boards, the whicker of a horse outside. The body responded gently, as if it knew its time had come. And that was the final mastery of the Viking sleep design, that it didn't just support rest, it supported waking. It honored the body in both directions, entering and exiting the realm of sleep without violence. It might sound idyllic, and yes, in many ways it was, but it was also born from necessity. Without proper sleep, you didn't survive winter. Without warmth and air, your children didn't wake. Without a place to dream, your spirit grew brittle. So the Vikings did what all wise people do. They paid attention. They adjusted. They remembered. And in doing so, they created a world in which sleep wasn't just something they did, it was something they understood. Chapter 8. Sleep in the Viking world was not merely a function of rest. It was a journey into realms just as vivid, complex, and consequential as waking life. Dreams were not dismissed as illusions, nor were they seen as random neurological byproducts. They were messages, sometimes from the gods, sometimes from the dead, and often from forces beyond comprehension. To the Viking mind, What occurred in sleep could alter the course of a life, a voyage, even a king's rule. And so, while the body rested beneath wool and fur, the mind ventured into landscapes shaped by myth, memory, and prophecy. Children were raised with this understanding. Elders told stories not just of battles and voyages, but of dreams that had foretold them. A warrior who dreamed of a serpent circling his home might awaken and immediately gather his weapons, sensing danger. A woman who dreamed of a black sun might postpone a marriage, a journey, or a birth. These dreams were not just anecdotes. They were warnings, blessings, curses, and they were honoured accordingly. This sacred view of dreaming shaped how people prepared for sleep. Just as they would cleanse themselves for a ritual, some would fast before sleep, believing that hunger sharpened the vision of the dreaming mind. Others burned herbs, juniper, angelica, or even mugwort, whose smoke was thought to purify the sleeper and open channels to the divine. Sleep was never just an end to the day. It was the threshold to something larger, and one had to cross it carefully. Within this spiritual frame, there also existed structure. Some dreams were considered common, born from heavy meals or strong drink. These were treated with skepticism as they lacked clarity or focus. But other dreams, the ones that woke a man in cold sweat or left a woman weeping in silence, those were different. They lingered. They carried meaning that refused to be ignored. The community might even gather the next day to discuss them, especially if they hinted at trouble or fortune. In this way, sleep became communal, not in body alone, but in consequence. Certain figures in Viking society were believed to be closer to the dream realm than others. The Volva, or seeress, was one such person, a woman trained in the arts of seeing, interpreting, and guiding dreams. Though feared by some, she was revered by many, especially in times of uncertainty. A Volva's dream was never dismissed. Her sleep, it was said, walked among the gods. These beliefs wove themselves into action. Before voyages, warriors often sought the guidance of dreams. They would sleep near sacred stones, on burial mounds, or beneath specific trees known for their dream-pulling power. These weren't superstitions, they were strategies. If a dream warned of a storm, the ship waited. If it showed a glowing path, the sails were raised. Success was not just won by muscle or axe. It was guided by the visions born in silence and shadow. Even love and marriage were touched by the dream world. A dream of two hawks flying together, or of shared fire, might be taken as a sign that a union was blessed. Alternatively, repeated dreams of drowning or of broken bone could spell the doom of a pairing before vows were ever spoken. People listened to these signs not because they were fragile, but because they were attuned. They believed that life spoke in riddles, and dreams were the language. But not all dreams were gentle. Some were brutal. Warriors who had seen battle often carried its images into sleep. Their dreams, what we might now call nightmares, were understood as hauntings, not punishments but reminders. Some believed these were the voices of those slain, or the warnings of those yet to be met in combat. To ignore them was to risk more than sleep. It was to risk forgetting. And forgetting, in the Viking world, was death's true victory. To protect themselves, many wore tokens while they slept. Runes carved into bone, small Thor's hammers strung on twine, stones polished in moonlight. These were not decorations. They were defences, shields for the soul as it wandered beyond the flesh. Children were given protective charms, and animals too were believed to have dreaming spirits that could be disturbed or guided. A restless dog might be shifted in sleep, gently whispered to, as if calming a warrior. The role of the hearth in all of this cannot be overstated. Its warmth was not just physical, it was spiritual. The hearth was where stories were told, where food was shared, and where dreams began. The fire's light, dancing on timber beams and flickering across sleeping faces, was a comfort and a gateway. It was said that if one stared into the coals just before sleep, they could glimpse their dreams to come. Whether this was true didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual, the intention, the sense that sleep was not aimless. Interestingly, there were tales of those who trained themselves to control dreams. These were not common folk, but gifted individuals who, through herbs, fasting and practice, could direct their dreaming mind, entering sleep with a question and waking with an answer. These lucid dreamers, if we may borrow the modern term, were prized as advisors. Some even claimed to meet gods in this way, not as metaphors, but as real presences. Odin, it was said, often whispered secrets to the mind in sleep, especially to those willing to sacrifice comfort for clarity. And so, every night in a Viking longhouse was also a night in a cathedral of sorts, not built of stone and glass, but of breath, bone, and belief. The sleepers were pilgrims, the bedding an altar, the dreams sacred texts waiting to be read, and whether one awoke laughing, crying, or simply calm, there was always the sense that something had been touched, something just beyond the skin of the world. Dreams shaped memory. Memory shaped legend, and legend in the Viking world shaped reality. It's no wonder then that sleep itself was honoured, protected, even feared, because in those hours where the world turned inward, the Vikings met not just themselves, but the very fabric of fate. And fate, as they knew better than most, always began in silence. The blurred border between dreams and prophecy in Viking life was not a casual belief. It was a deeply structured system of meaning that influenced decision-making at every level of society. And nowhere was this more apparent than in matters of war. Before raids, entire crews of men might fast for a day, lay their heads down upon shields, or sleep in a circle near the sea, each silently hoping for a vision, a sign, a visitation that could justify the blood to come. For many, going to war without the blessing of a dream was unthinkable, akin to walking blind into death's open arms. What made Viking dream culture so unique was not only its intensity, but also its communal trust in the phenomenon. In modernity, we might hesitate to act on a dream. We're taught to separate emotion from strategy, instinct from analysis. But the Viking world did not operate under the same assumptions. Their epistemology, the way they constructed truth, was layered with myth, woven with intuition and legitimized by collective memory. If a warrior said he had dreamed of blood sinking into snow, his chieftain listened. If a farmer's daughter woke in tears from a dream of wolves beneath the floorboards, her father might delay that week's harvest trip. Dreams didn't guarantee events, but they forecasted moods, warned of imbalance, hinted at the movement of the unseen. Animals, too, were drawn into this worldview. Dreaming was not a privilege of humans alone. Horses were said to thrash in their sleep if a coming death hovered nearby. Dogs whined as warnings. Birds seen in dreams were omens. Crows foretold change. Gulls suggested loss at sea. Owls spoke of secrets. To a people whose survival depended on reading the world's signals with accuracy, winds, waves, clouds, and stars, it made sense that the soul's nighttime voyages would be read just as carefully. Interestingly, many of these beliefs formed organically, independent of formal doctrine or priestly enforcement. There was no Viking church to dictate dream canon. There were seers, elders, and oral traditions, yes, but no single dogma. This allowed for a rich ecosystem of interpretation. Some families kept dream journals, etching symbolic events onto bone or horn. Others relied on the memory of elders, who served as walking dream encyclopedias, capable of recalling similar visions from decades ago and drawing meaning through comparison. One widespread motif in Viking dream accounts is the idea of crossing thresholds, a dreamer moving over a bridge, stepping through a broken door, or walking barefoot across ice. These were taken as signs of transition, whether into adulthood, battle, or even death. The direction mattered. Left was often associated with loss, misfortune, or the spirit world. Right was linked to strength, favour, or divine guidance. These weren't arbitrary associations. They arose from repeated cultural reinforcement, from stories shared around fires, and from generations watching the patterns of fate unfold. Dreams also held political power. Leaders known for having true dreams gained loyalty beyond their strategic skill. A chieftain whose dreams often aligned with reality was seen as favoured by Odin or Frigg. Some leaders even used dreams to claim legitimacy, citing visions as evidence of divine right or ancestral blessing. In an age without written contracts, dream accounts could act as binding social agreements. If a dying man dreamed that his land should go to a certain nephew, it was honoured. If a woman dreamed of a coming flood, and it came, her voice carried more weight at the next council. But the most powerful dreams were the ones that unsettled the entire community. Shared dreams, simultaneous visions, or recurring patterns seen across villages. These were feared. If 3 different men dreamed of fire on the same night, it was said that a great loss loomed. If children spoke of faceless visitors in sleep, it might be taken as a sign of shifting spirits or the approach of a disease. In such times, rituals were performed not to dispel the dream, but to acknowledge it, to show the unseen world that its message had been received. Even deathbed dreams held weight. The last dreams of the dying were recorded, passed down, and remembered like scriptures. If a warrior described seeing a field of golden grain or a hall with shields for walls, it was said he had glimpsed Valhalla. If a woman dreamed of water and silence, perhaps she had seen the realm of hell. These final visions comforted the living and reminded them that death, too, was a crossing, not an end. One remarkable aspect of this culture was how it avoided the binary of good dreams versus bad dreams. Instead, dreams were viewed as messengers, some welcome, some alarming, but all worthy of consideration. A terrifying dream was not automatically evil. It could be a challenge, a warning, or even a hidden blessing. A pleasant dream might be deceptive. What mattered was context, timing, and the wisdom of the dreamer. Dreams were never interpreted in isolation. They were weighed against events, behaviors, weather, even smells. A dream of drowning in a year of drought might mean something far different than the same dream in a year of floods. The integration of dreams into daily Viking life also served as a psychological release. In a world filled with violence, uncertainty, and constant labor, the dreamscape offered a space where emotions could surface, fears confronted, grief processed, desires explored. Sleep was therapy, vision quest, divine commune, and personal reflection, all woven into one. And because this process was respected, people did not need to hide their dreams. Vulnerability was not weakness, it was data. The full spectrum of Viking dreaming. Its mysticism, its pragmatism, its unshakable cultural presence reminds us how differently pre-modern minds approach the idea of the subconscious. For them, the dreaming mind was not sub-anything. It was a peer to the waking self, a sibling spirit that walked parallel paths, gathering truths that the daylight could not reveal. In the end, sleep was not an escape from the world. It was an entrance into a deeper one. And in that realm of mist, firelight, and shadowed gods, the Vikings found something most of us have forgotten, that rest is sacred, and dreams are real enough to steer the waking world. Chapter 9. As darkness settled over the Norse world, the Viking longhouse transformed. What had been the centre of work, grinding, weaving, carving, brewing, became a world of stories, heat, smell, and sound. The hearth no longer just cooked meals, it crackled like a living presence. Shadows played across timber walls. The smell of smoke, wet wool, fermented mead, and salted fish thickened the air. The longhouse was not quiet at night. It was alive. Here, sleep was not the only event of the evening. For the Vikings, night was its own social ritual. Before beds were drawn from benches and cloaks laid down for the children, there was always a time of talk and laughter. Midnight meals, small though they were, often followed the rhythm of song, tale-telling, or quiet craftwork. These weren't grand feasts, but they were sacred in their own way, often just warm porridge, dried meat, or remnants of the day's catch reheated over coals and soaked with ale. But in the silence of northern nights, these modest gatherings felt mythic. Children learned to associate the fading light not with fear, but with story. It was in this glow that elders recited the great sagas, the deaths of kings, the tricks of Loki, the travels of Freya. These were not bedtime stories to soothe. They were tools to imprint identity, shape imagination, prepare the spirit for the world beyond the village. When the tales grew darker, when betrayal, war, and death entered the verses, no one turned away. Even the young absorbed it, understanding that knowledge of hardship was as essential as knowledge of harvest. There were no doors in the Viking longhouse. Curtains of woven wool or hide separated sleeping spaces, but sound moved freely. Snores overlapped with whispers. The suckling of infants met the rasp of sharpening knives. In some houses, goats or chickens might roost in the corners. Occasionally, a restless dog would pad between figures, sniffing out leftover scraps or settling beside the warmest fire. It was a tangled intimacy, deeply human, unapologetically raw. Some evenings, after ale had loosened tongues and the fire had burned low, secrets would be shared, small confessions, forbidden desires, the names of ancestors who visited in dreams. This was not gossip. It was legacy. Each person carried the responsibility of memory. A smith might tell how his father once forged a blade for a jowl, and how it sang when drawn. A grandmother might whisper the birth omens of each grandchild, tracing their lives through the movements of stars. And in these moments, food was never just food. The act of eating became a continuation of ritual. Even a scrap of dried fish passed from hand to hand was heavy with memory of the fjord it came from, the net that caught it, the hands that salted and dried it. Bread, too, held meaning. Coarse, blackened loaves marked seasons. Honey cakes told of festivals. What survived in winter storerooms was not only sustenance, but proof of endurance. Every bite had survived the sea, the cold, the dark. Beyond the longhouse walls, the world was far from still. Wind clawed at the thatch. Snow sometimes whispered against the beams. Wolves cried in the distance, and if one listened carefully, one might hear a response from a mother calming her child with ancient lullabies, or a father promising stories if silence returned. Nature was not separate from sleep. It pressed in, always. The positioning within the longhouse also told quiet stories of power, affection, and lineage. The hearth's warmth did not reach all corners equally. Elders were given the warmest spots near the fire. Children clustered beside them, drawing security from their presence. Young couples often took corners, wrapped in each other under wool blankets. Those without kin, guests, or outcasts might sleep nearest the cold entry flap. None of this needed saying. Everyone simply knew. On certain nights, when the mood was right or the moon full and high, the longhouse saw not just feasts, but ritual gatherings. These were not wild orgies, as modern fantasy often imagines, but deeply symbolic acts tied to fertility, the turning of seasons, and ancestral gratitude. People didn't separate the sacred from the sensual. To them, life was one continuous rhythm of need, offering, response, a whispered name, a shared blanket, a song half sung into the skin of another. These were acts of meaning. The act of sleeping beside another was layered. To lie close to kin or lover was to synchronize breath, warmth, memory. It allowed fears to be voiced in quiet, regrets to be exhaled into straw pillows. Many believed the proximity of others enhanced the power of dreams. That shared sleep meant shared vision, and in this way, the longhouse became a collective mind at rest. Yet privacy still found its corners. A mother nursing a child beneath a wool shawl. A boy staring into the coals, tracing patterns into the dirt with a stick. A father slipping outside to relieve himself beneath the stars and returning slower than he left, having stopped to speak to the wind. Each soul found solitude not through isolation, but within the layers of life pressed around them. And even when all had settled, when the last ember hissed, the last cough faded, and the longhouse exhaled its long breath into night, there remained one final ritual: listening. The Vikings believed that the night had its own voice, and to sleep without hearing it was to miss half the story. The creak of timber, the murmur of dreams, the breath of the sea, always pulsing, always there. In such a world, midnight was not the dead center of sleep. It was the pivot point of being, a time when the boundary between waking and dreaming dissolved. When the body rested, yes, but the soul wandered, watched, learned. And those who learned to listen at midnight did not wake the same. Though most of the world quieted under the weight of sleep, within the longhouse, subtle currents of life continued to flow. Beneath the furs and straw, not everyone slept at once. Someone always stirred. A mother woke to turn her child or pull the blanket higher over a fevered brow. An elder, troubled by an old wound or memory, shifted near the hearth, poking at the coals for heat, or simply to remind himself he was still here. The night was not a single, uniform silence. It was a layered soundscape of rustles, murmurs, and breath. There were those, too, who rose deliberately at night, not because of discomfort, but because the midnight hours were sacred. Certain crafts were best done under stars. A young woman might spin thread in solitude, believing moonlight made the fibres stronger. A carver might trace outlines into bone, trusting his hand more in stillness. These quiet acts weren't distractions from rest. They were extensions of it. In Viking thought, labour and leisure weren't opposites, both were rhythms of being. If your hands worked while your mind wandered gently, it was a kind of rest. Guards rotated shifts outside the longhouse. Though it was rare for threats to approach after nightfall, who would cross the forest or icy field to attack when they could not see their own feet? Caution was still ritual. More than wolves or raiders, it was fire they feared. A single spark from the hearth could catch the dry straw of a sleeping mat. So one man, always alert, paced near the walls, listening for crackles that didn't belong, or a child's sudden cough. Meanwhile, dreams flourished in the haze of ale-soaked sleep. These weren't always grand visions of gods or omens. More often, they were tender, strange, deeply personal relived arguments, imagined hunts, lost mothers returning with bread in hand. These dreams were spoken of at breakfast, not with mystical awe, but with the familiarity of shared folklore. "I dreamed father was fishing again," someone would say. Or, "I was falling through ice, but I could breathe under it." Dreams were like weather reports worth noting, especially when they changed suddenly. At the centre of this nocturnal world remained the fire, always tended, always symbolic. It was never allowed to die, even in the poorest homes. Embers were banked in ash, protected like sleeping children. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was continuity. It connected the present to the ancestors, who once sat in the same glow, told the same stories, dreamed the same fears. In some longhouses, a single stone in the hearth was said to have come from the first family fire, generations ago, carried from valley to valley, home to home. As dawn approached, the mood within the longhouse shifted. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but like a tide returning. One person stirred, another reached for water, or rubbed sleep from their eyes. The children often woke first, not with joy, but with the slow grogginess of cold floors and stiff limbs. A goat bleated, a pot scraped. Somewhere, a man stretched and groaned, his body remembering the axe it must lift again. The longhouse did not roar to life. It hummed, reassembled, thick with breath and scent. Yet there was one moment before the true beginning of day, just before the light bled through the smoke hole overhead, when time seemed to hold its breath. The coals glowed like a dragon's eye. The air was heavy with the sleep of 30 people. And in that breathless pause, the longhouse existed in both worlds, the fading dream and the waking world. It was then that the mind, half awake, still clung to symbols from the night. A hawk in the window, a word remembered from a dream, a song hummed low from someone who didn't know they were singing. Often, this was the hour when choices were made, not shouted, not written, but understood. A man might decide to speak with his brother about old grievances. A woman might make peace with a lost pregnancy. A child, having dreamed of a sword, might finally ask for lessons. These decisions, like the dreams they rose from, did not come with fanfare. They unfolded later in action. Mead barrels, emptied by night, were sometimes refilled in morning silence, not for drinking, but for trade. Bread dough was kneaded with hands still swollen from sleep. And sometimes, before true work began, there was singing, not loud, not meant for others, but sung to the rhythm of movement. These were lullabies in reverse waking songs. They reminded the body that life continued, that each new day, no matter how cold, could be met with the memory of warmth. One of the quietest truths about Viking life is how deeply interconnected every act was. There was no such thing as a meaningless gesture. To fold a blanket neatly, to clean the soot from a spoon, to warm one's toes at the hearth before stepping out into frost. These were acts of dignity, and perhaps that's what gave their nights such texture. It wasn't that their lives were always harder than ours, though they often were. It's that every small thing felt earned, noticed, and remembered. As the full light of dawn painted the timber walls, the longhouse gave a final sigh. The night, with all its whispered stories, low fires, shared blankets, and wandering dreams, was done, but it would return. And in that return, each person would once again enter the shared ritual of rest, of heat, of memory, not as escape, not as obligation, but as a return to something older than time, where sleep was not an end, but a gathering, and the longhouse, with its smoke-dark beams and braided shadows, waited always to receive them again. In the Viking world, death was not an interruption, it was a passage, and sleep, with all its quiet rituals, shared warmth, and drifting dreams, was the closest preparation for that journey. The line between sleeping and dying was softer in their eyes, a veil rather than a wall. Every night could be a small rehearsal, every final breath a return home. To die, for them, was not to disappear, but to move into another longhouse, somewhere across the misty waters, where the fire never died and the mead never ran out. Funeral rites often began at night, sometimes before the body even cooled. Families gathered not in silence, but in motion. Hair was braided, wounds were washed, dirt was gently rubbed from beneath the fingernails. Not to purify, but to honour. The dead deserved to look like themselves, to appear not as they died, but as they lived, fierce, tired, loved. This preparation was intimate. A sister might cradle her brother's head as she combed it. A mother might trace her child's scars and remember the story behind each one. These were not acts of grief, they were acts of deep remembering. The bed prepared for the dead was different than the sleeping spaces of the living. It was built with care, often inside the same longhouse, sometimes on a boat, sometimes in the open field under stars. Layers of wool, furs and feathers cradled the body. Weapons were placed within reach, swords, axes, spears, or even fishing knives, depending on who the sleeper had been. Trinkets were tucked beneath arms, carved beads looped around wrists, and small food bundles slid under the legs. These were not offerings, they were luggage. It was believed the journey ahead would be long. And so, this final bed was a kind of boat. Whether it floated or not, it was meant to carry the soul from this world into the next. Some were burned, sending fire and ash skyward to mingle with stars. Others were buried deep into the earth, pressed beneath heavy stones and marked with runes. The type of death didn't matter as much as the care taken in those final hours. What mattered was that the body was not left alone. The dead were watched, guarded by stories, by weeping, by silence when there was nothing left to say. There was no uniform prayer, no single god who claimed the dead. Odin might receive warriors, Frasier might welcome lovers, Hell might guide the slow, the tired, the quiet ones who simply drifted away without blood or glory. But all were treated as though their destination was known. Confidence in the next world helped soothe those still breathing. He is with the All-Father now, they might whisper, or she sails with Injord across the sea. These words weren't for comfort, they were instructions to the soul, a reminder to move forward, to not linger. Sometimes the dead returned, not physically, but in dreams, in flickers of firelight, in the shifting creak of beams at night. Vikings believed the spirit could wander, especially if it wasn't sent off properly. That's why rites were so meticulous. If a warrior's axe was forgotten, if a mother's comb was not laid beside her, unrest could follow. Crops might fail, cows might miscarry, dreams might grow violent. The solution wasn't fear, it was respect. To forget the dead was to forget oneself. The burial bed reflected the life lived. A jarl's resting place might be a ship, pulled onto land and buried beneath a mound so high it broke the horizon. But even the poor were honoured with all they could give. A girl might be laid in her grandmother's wedding dress. A fisherman buried with the oar he carved as a boy. These gestures were currency, not for gods, but for memory. The living needed to remember who the dead had been, to keep saying their name, to pass their stories, to bake the bread they liked on cold nights. Children ask questions, as they always do. Is Uncle sleeping? Will Grandma wake up in Valhalla? And the answers were gentle, never absolute. Yes, he's sailing now. She dreams forever, with her sisters beside her. The point was not accuracy, it was belonging. No Viking, however young, was raised to think of death as theft. It was a trade, a moving from this fire to another, just beyond the forest line. As the burial ended, sometimes a feast followed. It was not joyful, it was not morbid, it was simply necessary. Food was shared because hunger still existed. Ale was passed because thirst didn't vanish with sorrow. These meals were not for forgetting. They were for anchoring the living, so they wouldn't drift too far into mourning. The stories told at these feasts were not always solemn. People laughed, remembered embarrassing moments, mocked the dead gently, as if they were still listening, and perhaps they were. Not all funerals were large. In winter, when snow buried the land, a body might be wrapped in skins and set beneath a cairn until the ground thawed. These temporary graves were treated with the same reverence. Songs were hummed, names were spoken, hands were placed on the mound, and promises whispered. We will come back, we will dig deep, you will not be forgotten. The longhouse, after a death, changed its rhythm. For days the fire might burn lower, meals might be quiet, songs less frequent, but slowly life crept back. Children laughed. A new loom was strung. Bread rose again. This was not disrespect. It was the deepest honour. To continue was to prove the dead had built something worth sustaining. Even in sleep, the dead stayed near. People felt them in dreams, in the shape of smoke, in the way a sparrow landed twice on the same beam. These signs were not debated. They were accepted. The world of the Vikings was full of such in-betweens. Sleep and death, fire and ash, memory and silence. To them, the truest way to honour the dead was to live fully, to sleep deeply, to love fiercely, to speak names loudly in the dark. When the torches finally dimmed and the last of the burial fires turned to embers, the longhouse was never quite the same. Something hung in the air denser than smoke, quieter than grief. It wasn't fear, it was presence. The sense that someone was still there, watching from the shadows, not to haunt, but to remind them that they were once held, once fed, once sung to, once warned, once loved. That sleep was never just a biological necessity, it was a spiritual rehearsal. Every return to the bed, every soft descent into dreams, carried echoes of that final journey. The Vikings saw the night differently after a death. Sleep became a sacred act, a reaffirmation of their own living heartbeat. The fire in the longhouse glowed with more meaning, as if every flicker of light honoured the one now missing. Blankets were tucked tighter. Breathing became more noticeable. Children, even if they didn't understand loss in its full shape, instinctively knew to curl a little closer to their parents. And the parents, hardened by weather and war, softened their limbs, letting tiny hands rest against their skin, as if that warmth could be passed down across generations. In these nights, some believed the deceased might visit in dreams, not as ghosts, but as familiars. A father giving advice beside a river that no longer existed. A sister humming a forgotten lullaby inside a cave of stars. These visions weren't questioned, they were welcomed, because in the Viking psyche, the veil between waking and sleeping, living and dying, was not something to be feared or broken, it was to be used. Communication with the dead was not only accepted, it was sought. Sleep became a bridge. Rituals continued long after the body was buried. Stones might be carved and placed beside the bed. Runes etched into wooden slats and hung above doorways to protect the soul of the house. Certain herbs, mugwort, juniper, yarrow, were burned in small bowls near the hearth to cleanse the air. These weren't superstitions. They were technologies of memory. Tools passed down not in books, but in behaviours, repeated until they became as natural as blinking. There was also a tradition of telling sleep, where the elders would speak to those who had passed as if they were still present at bedtime, not in sadness, but in continuation. A mother might murmur, "We're safe tonight, thanks to your boat," or a brother might whisper, "You would have laughed at how hard it snowed today." These were not one-sided conversations. The dead responded, not always with words, but through feelings, through sudden clarity, through the fire refusing to die out before dawn. These exchanges built something beyond memory. They built companionship across realms. Children were taught to listen at night, not for danger, but for signs. The wind knocking once against the beams, the smell of rain in the middle of snow, a dog lifting its head with no sound. These subtle cues were believed to be messages, not omens, but reminders that someone still watched, still cared. That sleep was a communal act, stretching beyond time. You didn't just sleep beside your kin, you slept beside the remembered. The cycle of seasons layered upon these rituals. In winter, when the nights grew longest, death and sleep became even more entwined. Solstice nights were particularly potent. The community gathered, not only to mark the sun's return, but to honour those who hadn't lived to see it. Fires were built high, shadows danced on the walls, and food was shared liberally: mead, barley stew, dried fish. Names were spoken aloud, one after another, until silence returned. It was not grief, it was architecture. Each name a stone in the great invisible house where all souls gathered. Eventually, life regained its pace. Crops needed tending, weapons needed sharpening, babies were born. But the sleeping habits formed in grief never left entirely. People held each other a little longer before turning in. Blankets were folded with more care. Elders slept closer to the hearth. And children were allowed to whisper just a little longer into the night, telling their dreams to the ones they could no longer see. The burial beds eventually sank into earth or were scattered into sea foam, but the act of preparing them had done something permanent. It had taught the living how to shape rest into ritual, how to see sleep not as weakness, but as a skill, a ceremony, a spiritual discipline. This was the legacy of the Viking knight, not in plunder, not in bloodshed, but in the quiet way they cradled both the living and the dead in the same deep silence. And so, each evening, when the wind howled across the fjords and the fire crackled low, someone would pull a blanket to their chin, close their eyes and drift. Not into nothingness, but into something shared. A room lit by memory, a bed warmed by ancestors, a darkness that was never empty. If you're still awake, you've just travelled through time with the drowsy historian. And if sleep found you somewhere along the way, then maybe the old gods did their work. Every week, we uncover lost rituals, forgotten lives, and the quiet truths that textbooks never tell. So, if you love drifting through history in the soft glow of candlelight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell number for more nighttime journeys. And tell us in the comments, what ancient world would you like to dream through next? Sleep well. Stay curious. The Drowsy Historian.